How's it going? So, what I wanted to do was finally actually get around to posting a video response regarding one of the two videos that I have up on my Ecological Atheist YouTube channel. The one I'm responding to is the moral relativism video, uh, and that's simply because it's the first one that I actually wrote some notes about. Now, how I actually really wanted to reply to it was have like somewhere down in the corner the actual video, and I could play it and just pause it at specific segments and then offer a response. But I haven't quite figured out how to do it, and I'm sort of new to using software to record myself and maybe add things into it. So I think as I learn more, I'll probably be able to figure out how that works, and maybe any of you who are kind enough to give me your time to watch this and know something about it, may be able to offer some guidance. So how I guess I'll start this is I've written quite a few notes that's covering at least what I think are specific points throughout the video at specific timestamps that I think are worth having a discussion about. So I'll just start. Basically, for the first minute and a half, it's a bit of an introduction. It's obviously Ravi Zacharias who's talking, as well as Dan Patterson, who's his colleague. Dan starts, and that starts at about at a minute and a half. And I guess the first thing that Dan starts talking about is this sweep of the Bible. And I guess what he's sort of referring to, at least, and I did ask him about this, is I think a number of different theological frameworks used to explain series of events in the Old Testament. And those three things that I think that he's referring to is covenant theology, dispensationalism, and the one that obviously he mentioned, which is progressive revelation. Now, I would suggest that anybody who's interested just go and have a quick read up about what those things actually are. I have myself, and I guess the issue that I have with them is that they still don't address or explain why God condoned slavery at, even at that point in time. It explains the time series of events in the Old Testament, but it doesn't explain why God condoned slavery. It doesn't do anything to address that. So it sort of leaves that sort of wanting for a further explanation as to why God would condone it rather than outlaw it in the same manner he would say stealing, for example. Moving on to 2 minutes. He says helping humans grow in culture. Now, I won't pretend to try and understand or predict what he is actually meaning by that, because it will likely be a straw man, and I'm not interested in doing that. So what I will say is that I'm not sure what benefit, aside from the culture itself that's having slaves, that slavery could actually have in facilitating culture. You only need to look back as far as what America was like not all that long ago, actually, and see how slavery was just terrible in that environment, and they thought it was great to have that because it was a way of getting a lot of work done and not having to pay somebody to do it. But at the end of the day, it was still very problematic for them, and it created more issues than it did good in the long run. But anyway, I won't go into too much detail about that. At 2 minutes 30, he refers to Jesus and the idea that, of course, as we go into the New Testament, that Jesus sort of had like brought a new vision into humanity, and I guess he's inferring that Jesus's view was that slavery would be abolished and outlawed. And I guess many actually refer to the specific segment in Matthew, and I don't know which one that is off the top of my head. And I'm sure you can find it relatively easy because I remember what it says, which is the law. Think not that I've come to abolish the law, for I've come to fulfill it. Not a jot or tittle shall change. But the thing is that my issue is that how Jesus refers to slaves in the New Testament is that it's not in the manner of, oh, have you not, have you not heard my message? My message is that we shouldn't be having slaves. All men and women should be treated equal. There should be equality everywhere. Slavery should just be outlawed. There's not. He's not sending that message. If you read how Jesus refers to slaves, he's referring to them as though he is a person in a society where there is slavery and it's a norm for him. It's just a normal way of life. And he doesn't seem to have qualms about it. Obviously, there may be some reservations if it's slaves of his own people. But he seems to be referring to it as though it's not an issue. At 3 minutes 40, now in this part here, it sort of annoys me because it's a common apologetic towards asking the difficult question of slavery in the Bible. And the apologetic is something along the lines of, well, when we think about the Old Testament and slavery, we're thinking more along the lines of indentured servitude. Now, the reason this annoys me is because it's really not true. Sure, within the Old Testament there is indentured servitude. I'm not saying there's not. However, there's certainly more than just indentured servitude. There is quite explicitly clear prescriptive decrees about slavery, and the slavery that we know today, such as chattel slavery. Leviticus 25:44-46 very clearly details almost the exact definition of what we understand today as chattel slavery. And I guess the element that, I guess the reason that I'm annoyed by that is because when you read it, it's very clear that it's not indentured servitude. And whilst I would like to believe that apologists who are saying this, we think of it more like indentured servitude rather than slavery, actually genuinely believe that, I'm not convinced that the people saying that really do genuinely believe that. If they read things like Leviticus 25:44, it's just not. It couldn't be further from the idea of indentured servitude. And the other problem with it is that even if it were true, say we were just looking at indentured servitude, and we looked at like Exodus 21, for example, the details behind how indentured servitude works are not clear, and they're not clear to the point that the way it would be implemented would be immoral. For example, it doesn't say how much needs to be owed before indentured servitude kicks in. So, do I owe, if I owed someone a drink and I couldn't pay them back, or if I owed someone, so if I accidentally spilled some wine on somebody's shirt and I had no money to replace it or repair it in any way, shape, or form, does indentured servitude as per Exodus 21 kick in? Which is 6 years of indentured servitude. What, because I couldn't fix a shirt? I mean, that doesn't seem entirely legit. But I guess the worst part of the whole element within Exodus 21 is the 7 to 11 part, where it specifically describes that females do not get to go free after the 6 years as males do. Now, why? Why is that the case? Why is there a gender inequality there? Why do females not get to go free but males do? I don't understand that. And if we're talking about indentured servitude, but we're also talking about the idea that females don't get to go free after 6 years, does that not void the idea of indentured servitude if it basically means that women can just can be kept for life at that point? The only clause for their release is if their master is displeased with them, which, if you read Exodus 21, 7 to 11, it has an air of sort of sexual slavery, you know, if she does not please her master. I can't imagine that's referring to cooking and soups and stuff. He also then talks about, so he says that people can essentially work for 6 years and go free, and as I said, women don't. And then there's also the idea where there's the catch-22 part, with a double-edged sword, where if you take on a male indentured servant and you give him a wife and they have children, the female, as per Exodus 21:7-11, is the property of the slave owner, and therefore the children too. So at the end of the 6 years, the male then has to make the decision of, does he go free, or does he leave his wife and children, who can't be any more than 5 years old at that point, with the slave owner? Seems like a bit of an emotional lasso there, right? Not sure many men would be too keen to leave their wife and their children for freedom at that point. But that's another, I won't go into too much detail about that. At 4 minutes 15, he says, in no place in the Bible are humans treated any less. That's simply not true. Yeah, as I said, Leviticus 25:44, that specifically details how humans can become property for life. So that basically thwarts that sentiment, which is that they become property. They're not treated as humans at that point. At 4 minutes 40, he mentions something about the idea that the future vision is so that it wouldn't be there. And my response to that was more, why is it immoral now and not back then? Like, and that was sort of my problem when we first started talking about the Bible suite, was why does he have to condone that then but not now? I mean, we understand, of course, through secular society and purely humanistic secular moral laws, we can reach the conclusion that slavery should be outlawed. But and that's partly why we object to the idea of slavery in the Bible now, is because we understand that, and it doesn't comport with the idea of a religion of peace or whatever. At 5 minutes 25, he talks about the sweep into the New Testament, which is still that idea of the Bible sweep. And as I mentioned earlier, slavery is still actively mentioned and referred to throughout the New Testament, as though the people that are referring to slaves are fully aware of slavery being practiced, seem to be okay with it, or at least they're not talking about it as though they're disgusted by it, and that it's something that should be abolished or outlawed, and that these people aren't following the New Testament properly. Jesus himself still does that. He's I've got some examples here of Titus 2:9-10, 1 Timothy 6:1-2, Colossians 3:22-24, Ephesians 6:5-8. These are all verses where slavery is referred to as though it's okay. Now, this next part, which is at 5 minutes 38, he makes quite an interesting point, which is about William Wilberforce and the abolitionists. Great, wonderful that people who could easily use the Bible to justify their owning of slaves are reaching the conclusion that slavery should be abolished. And I know William Wilberforce himself, he references his biblical understanding or biblical ideals as the fueling for his advocating of having slavery abolished. he says that that's the case, but I'm not. Again, it sort of contradicts what the Bible does say, because you could just as easily justify having slaves, and nowhere in the Bible does it explicitly abolish slavery. So if you are using biblical thinking, you are using your own subjective view of what a specific sentiment within the Bible says, to apply it to slavery. It's not as clear cut as, well, clearly I don't steal, right? I shouldn't be stealing things. Well, why shouldn't you be stealing things? Well, because the Bible says thou shalt not steal. There's nothing like that in regards to slavery. So I would argue that William Wilberforce is actually using what we identify today as, a secular humanist approach to human rights. If you read segments on why he was against slavery, you can clearly see he holds empathy for people being treated terribly, which is exactly what was going on. And likely, as we would do today, if we were to see people in slavery, we'd probably look at them and go, wow, that's really awful that these people are being treated so terribly. And you use the consequentialist side of you to go, oh, gee, if I was in that situation, I'd probably feel really crap. So perhaps the people actually in the situation feel, infinitely worse than my imagining what it would be like. And it's very easy to see how that could fuel someone wanting to make a change, right? So yeah, I'm not convinced that he was solely using biblical thinking to reach that conclusion. And plus, there were lots of abolitionists that were doing the same thing at the same time, who were not religious at all. So yeah, abolitionists came from many different angles. It wasn't just William Wilberforce. Well, but it was a good thing that he did, though. At 6 minutes 30, he talks about, and this is, I think, this segment, and at 6 minutes 54 is why I named his response moral relativism, because I think that was shortly after I talked to him, or I got a chance to make a little comment, which was about the fact that it wasn't indentured servitude, it was slavery, and he sort of responded by saying, there was no other option, and then he used the example of, if men went to war and they all died, what opportunity do the women have? That slavery was the best option for them. There wasn't any welfare system. There was nothing in place. They couldn't do anything. Slavery was the only way. It's a pretty contentious claim, because we lack a lot of information about what life was actually like at that time. And we argue today the reason that slavery should be abolished is because it's a violation of human rights. And assuming that humans were much like how we are now, just of course, without a lot of technology and understanding of the world, that if we deem it immoral now, it shouldn't be moral then, because it was a different context. That comes back to the point of, in what context is slavery ever considered moral? Our understanding of what humanity is like, we would argue that there is no context in which owning a slave or owning a person as property would ever be considered moral. And I think that's sort of what he's inferring, that because it was that time period and there was no other option, it was the best thing they had. But I would argue it's not. You could simply not have the rule that people are kept for life, or in the indentured servitude type of thing. Have a sentiment that says, somebody shall work for as long as, or that is deemed appropriate for what is owed, something like that. So that it's not every single indentured servant is 6 years. But I would also add to that how slaves are purported to have been treated during those periods of time. Some slaves would argue that they'd prefer to be dead, you know, they weren't treated the best, and a lot of them did die due to the treatment. He talks about prostituting, or prostitution, sorry, and if you look at how a lot of female slaves were treated, it largely as a form, well, it's just sex slavery, really. At least in prostitution, they get, you know, there's some, they get remuneration for it. But that doesn't make it any better either, though. And this basically, yeah, as I said, it's sort of, he sort of capped his segment off because we're about to start where Ravi Zachariah steps in. But yeah, that capped off that segment is basically an appeal to moral relativism, and it doesn't pardon God's ineptitude at specifically setting aside or setting an abolishment of slavery from the get-go, as he did with, you know, stealing, as I've used as an example already. But at 7 minutes 16, Ravi is in, and I will preface his segment as largely not really addressing my question at all. He does what I think, personally, what Ravi Zacharias does best, which is tell stories, but the stories don't shed any light on why slavery is condoned in the Bible, why God condones slavery. It doesn't provide any insight or clarity. He's a very well-spoken man, and you know, he has a very good way of talking, and I admire him for that. But I don't think he's in the business of critically thinking about what's being said and addressing what's being said. So yes, he starts off by saying that my assumption is very flawed, and he goes on to saying that in the Near Eastern world, you know, slavery was rampant throughout the Near Eastern world. Everybody was having slaves. Yeah, sure, that may be the case. And you know, under a natural explanation, sure, that may be the case. That may be the case. Sorry, that the most powerful nations were subjugating and forcing the weaker into slavery. I'm not sure why that's relevant, because, you know, making that point is more or less just a naturalistic observation. It was the case. It doesn't shed any light as to why God condoned it. You know, it doesn't pardon anything. And he obviously mentioned Gandhi in this case. I'm not sure what relevance that has. Again, as I said with the preface, Ravi likes to tell stories, but I tried to think about what relevance those stories have. I can't figure it out. I'm not sure what relevance they have. But I'm sure the people listening to him, you know, think that obviously answers something. I just don't think it really does. And he mentions the number of countries who practiced it. I think that's sort of irrelevant. He also mentioned about Abraham got Isaac, a slave woman, as a bride. I think as a way to say, look, slaves weren't, you know, treated that badly. You know, they were often, you know, used as wives. So obviously they can't be thought of that bad. It doesn't. Yeah, that still doesn't pardon anything. That's still okay. So we have women slaves that are forced into, you know, are chosen at the whim of men against any sort of will they may have to be brides. Largely, I would assume, picked upon their looks. And oh yes, sorry, going back a little bit before that, he says that Gandhi was saying that that the West were not operating under their presuppositions. Now, two points to this. Again, I don't know what relevance it really has. But I guess if I were to sort of think about what relevance it may have, it would be that Gandhi is somehow Gandhi has somehow access to the more truthful sentiment of what the New Testament is about, and he's saying that the West are not following that. So that sort of begs the question as to how does Gandhi know what the true interpretation or the true meaning of the New Testament is, and why is that more true than what the West are doing? Presumably that, you know, the West may have likely spent far more years studying the Bible than Gandhi. I don't know if that's the case or not, but you would assume it would be. Yeah, and also I don't understand how you can presuppose something that somebody teaches you. That doesn't make any sense either, but that's sort of on the side. He talks about at 8 minutes 43 how laws alone failed, and how laws alone can be exploited, and that, you know, Jesus came. But that implies that the laws that God put in place failed. So an all-powerful, all-knowing God couldn't have put laws in place that wouldn't fail. I'm not sure how that works either, and I'm not sure how that explains anything. If laws fail and the laws come from God, then surely God must be responsible for that failure. Anyways, he talked about Martin Luther King talking from the scripture and giving sermons. Again, he may have had some sermons on slavery, but I'm pretty sure his sermons were not specifically on slavery. At roughly 10 minutes, he says something that sort of makes me laugh. He says, "Never judge a religion by its abuse." I'm sorry, but if a religious belief has within its doctrine prescriptive measures that we identify as immoral today, and we can demonstrate why they're immoral or the damaging in some fashion, then yes, I will judge that religion based upon its abuse that comes from that type of mentality, or those prescriptive means and those that follow it. What other option do you have? Do you only judge it on its good? Because that seems... I could say, for example, there was a religion that was 99% evil. You know, sacrifice every second child. You know, if somebody hurts you a little bit, kill their whole family. All these, you know, things that we would just think of, all the evil things that could be in a religion. But for one weekend in every year, they have a specific tenet where it's treat everybody with care and love, and invite everybody around and share food and help rebuild and you know, people's lives for the weekend. Brilliant. That's a really, really nice thing. That's a really good thing to have. So if we're not judging the religion on its abuse, then do we just judge it by the one weekend a year? No, that's not how it works. You judge people by their actions. And if people or a specific set of rules and commandments have prescriptive measures that incite people to act in a certain way that's immoral, then we will judge them for that. People are judged by through that measure and those means all the time. So I don't think that's very fair to say that. And then he does what Ravi often does when it comes to making a moral assessment, is that he will try to... I'm not sure if Ravi really doesn't know that you can reach... you can have a natural moral framework that doesn't invoke any sort of supernatural entity, or isn't based on God, that there are purely naturalistic explanations for how we reach moral sentiments. But he keeps inferring that there isn't, that I can't have a moral judgment about slavery. And he says, you know, natural law doesn't give you that. and he says if evolutionary theory was taken as a metaphysical proposition, well, thankfully we don't take it as a metaphysical proposition. Then nature is tooth and claw. You can't. It would be everybody's going around killing each other, survival of the fittest. But the thing is that evolutionary theory there is a lot more to it. There's behavioral ecology. There's evolutionary behavior. There's studying of how animals operate in communities. You can see great examples of rudimentary moral frameworks in relatively lesser animal species, such as wolves, for example, where they're clearly not going around, mauling their own family to bits because, well, that's what evolution would say they do, which it doesn't. There's behaviors and specific frameworks for operating and behaving that also enhance the survivability of specific populations or specific species. And some of those things can be, acting in ways that we would look at and go, well, that's clearly a moral way of acting. Chimpanzees pull caring for their young, looking after one another and protecting them from invaders, and very many sentiments that we would look at and we could see are very, very relatable to how we operate. It's not. I think Ravi just he hasn't read into that, or he just chooses not to. Because there are very easy ways to reach an understanding of where that framework actually comes from. And it sort of ends there, really. He sort of goes towards the, you can't judge slavery to be immoral because I can't through naturalistic moral frameworks. Which, going back to my question about slavery, it doesn't, to me, that's an admission that he can't explain why God condones slavery, and that he clearly does, because Ravi doesn't really seem too interested in trying to offer explanations, but rather talk around it and try to put everything else into perspective, as though, hey, look, everywhere else is doing slavery as well, so therefore, you can't, it should be okay. And by the way, you can't judge it to be immoral anyway, because you're using a naturalistic moral framework to assess it, or you have to borrow from mine. So I guess in summary, my question wasn't really answered, and there is an overarching theme of moral relativism, hence why I've named it this. The slavery in the Bible is certainly worded in a way that conforms with the definition of chattel slavery. It isn't just indentured servitude, as is often said. And yeah, I would suggest that if you're having conversations or you have friends and so on, to ask them about, why does the Bible condone slavery? Why does God specifically, assumedly that the Bible is the word of God to some extent, why does God condone slavery? And like I asked, if God once condoned slavery, but we as humans in a secular society have outlawed it, not using any sort of, you don't have to use any religious ideal to reach the sentiment that slavery should be outlawed. Are we wrong? Is purely subjective moral reasoning reaching the conclusion that slavery is wrong? Is that wrong? Could we go back to having slaves and be justified? Some would argue no, but again, you could use the Bible to argue yes. Thank you for watching, and I'm sorry if I rambled on a bit, and I plan to do another response to the other video, and I'll hopefully get around to that soon. Yeah, let me know what you think. If you have any comments, or if I've made any mistake, or I've said something incorrectly, I'm always willing to, to correct my mistakes and learn more. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it.